You wake up. The clock says 6:43 a.m. The sky outside is barely lit, your body aches faintly from the stiffness of age, and your mind immediately races toward the day's obligations. Somewhere in that swirl of thoughts, the unpaid bill, your adult child who hasn't called in weeks, the appointment next Thursday, there's a quiet question trying to get through. Is this it? By midlife, many of us have learned to tolerate a dull ache of spiritual disconnection. We've learned how to perform well, how to support others, how to survive routines. But Terence McKenna, the unconventional thinker and consciousness explorer, would call this a kind of cultural hypnosis, a sleepwalk engineered by societal norms and inherited expectations. He insisted that most of us live inside a narrative prison, and that the key to escape isn't dramatic or esoteric. It can begin with something deceptively small. 7 minutes, that's all. McKenna believed the most profound transformations occur not through grand gestures, but through subtle, consistent interruptions in consciousness. In his words, culture is not your friend. It doesn't always serve your growth, especially not in a society obsessed with productivity, distraction, and external approval. But there's an opening. If you can take even a few minutes a day to turn inward, challenge consensus reality, and invite novelty into your awareness, you begin to loosen the grip of that cultural hypnosis. Imagine this. You sit for 7 minutes every morning, not to meditate in silence, but to ask the forbidden questions. Who am I without this role, this identity, this expectation? What is this moment asking of me? Where have I stopped really seeing the world? In those minutes, you're not wasting time. You're returning to yourself. You don't need psychedelics or isolation to shift your reality. McKenna's point was never just about substances. It was about sovereignty. It was about reclaiming the mind from imposed ideas, even if for a few minutes a day. 7 minutes isn't a ritual. It's a radical act of psychological freedom. And at 45, 50, 60 years old, the idea that your inner world could still change might seem naive. But ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you gave yourself permission to change the terms of your own life? That's what this practice offers. 7 minutes to question the trance. 7 minutes to reconnect with the real you. 7 minutes to begin again. At some point in our lives, we stop noticing how much of what we believe isn't actually ours. We absorb opinions from the news, habits from our peers, behaviors from our parents, and we start to call that truth. We confuse routine with reality. But Terence McKenna warned us, what we call reality is just a culturally sanctioned hallucination. It's not that reality doesn't exist, it's that we inherit a version of it shaped by systems that want predictability, not awakening. This is especially true in American culture. From a young age, we're taught to define success by what we produce, how we appear, and how we compare. The result? By midlife, many feel emotionally bankrupt, despite having checked all the boxes. A stable job, a decent home, a partner. And yet a deep sense that something essential was left behind in the pursuit. The truth is, reality has always been more flexible than we were told. McKenna believed that our minds are participatory agents, not passive observers. The world doesn't just happen to us, we co-create it through what we focus on, question, and refuse to blindly accept. 7 minutes a day becomes a way to interrupt inherited reality and start choosing your own. But this isn't easy, especially after 40 or 50 years of living a certain way. Questioning your reality at this age can feel destabilizing. Friends might not understand, your partner may resist, your children might already see you in a fixed role. But this is where personal evolution begins, in the quiet courage to reclaim authorship of your perception. McKenna often spoke about the importance of the felt presence of immediate experience. In plain terms, what's true now, right in front of you? Not what should be, not what others expect, but what is, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. 7 minutes of presence each day is not about reaching some mystical state. It's about undoing the trance of collective noise and returning to the direct experience of being. So, when you sit for those minutes, maybe with your morning coffee, maybe in your car before work, ask yourself, whose voice is shaping my thoughts right now? you might be surprised how often it isn't yours. There's a subtle kind of death that happens when nothing surprises you anymore. When the days blur, when each morning feels like a rehearsal of the last, and you begin to expect less from life, not because you're ungrateful, but because you've stopped believing in the unexpected. Terence McKenna called this the death of novelty. To him, novelty wasn't about excitement or entertainment. It was the lifeblood of consciousness. The moment we stop engaging with what is new, uncertain, or awe-inspiring, we begin to collapse into stagnation. And over time, that stagnation hardens into cynicism, a quiet but corrosive belief that nothing can really change. But novelty isn't found only in travel or dramatic life shifts. In fact, the kind of novelty that heals the psyche is often small, subtle, and chosen. It might look like reading a paragraph from a book that challenges your worldview, listening to a piece of music you've never heard before, sitting in silence and allowing a memory you've long suppressed to surface. 7 minutes a day can become a ritual of novelty, a window where you give yourself permission to encounter something unfamiliar. The goal isn't productivity, it's aliveness. McKenna often said that the universe is not a machine, but a living mystery. And mystery, by nature, requires humility. When we become too certain, too convinced that we've figured it out, that we know who we are and what life is, we stop participating in that mystery. We become rigid, defensive, asleep. But novelty melts that rigidity. It interrupts the expected. It invites the unknown back in. For someone in their 50s or 60s, this can feel threatening at first. We've spent decades building certainty, patterns, and identities, but certainty isn't peace. It's often just protection. True peace comes from the courage to meet life anew, to admit we don't know everything, to wonder again. So in those 7 minutes, ask, what have I avoided? What have I dismissed? What haven't I noticed? Because even a drop of newness each day can begin to reawaken the soul. When people hear Terence McKenna's name, they often think of psychedelics. Ayahuasca, psilocybin, DMT, these were tools he championed not for escape, but for awakening. But what's often misunderstood is that McKenna wasn't just advocating for substances. He was advocating for a way of seeing, a willingness to dissolve the boundaries of habitual thinking. And here's the truth he knew well. You don't need a chemical to experience a shift in consciousness. For many in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, the idea of psychedelics might feel inaccessible, unrelatable, or even irresponsible. But the deeper message of McKenna was this: your own mind, when given space and permission, is the most powerful portal to transformation. 7 minutes of genuine inner exploration, without distraction, without agenda, can be as disruptive to your habitual mindset as any drug. Why? Because we are rarely alone with ourselves. Even when we think we are, our minds are cluttered with background noise, tasks, regrets, media, and memories we're trying to outrun. But those minutes, if used intentionally, can become a space where we begin to hear again. McKenna spoke often about language, how it shapes reality, how it limits and liberates us. In your daily 7 minutes, consider exploring language consciously. Say a word slowly in your mind, like freedom, truth, or change, and follow where it takes you, not intellectually, but emotionally. Where do you feel resistance? What part of you doubts the word? What part aches for it? This is what it means to experience the psychedelic without the substance, to allow your perception to soften, your boundaries to loosen, your mind to drift beyond the expected. Not dangerously, but curiously. For older adults who've lived through decades of social conditioning, trauma, and responsibility, these 7 minutes are more than self-care. They are rebellion, a quiet daily protest against numbness, a reclaiming of your right to think freely, feel deeply, and exist outside the narrow narrative you were given, and you don't need permission. It's been drilled into most of us since childhood, especially in American culture. Do more, be more, achieve more. From school to career to family, we are rewarded for movement, for output, for measurable success. And yet, somewhere along the way, many realize, all this doing doesn't necessarily lead to being. By midlife, it's common to feel haunted by an invisible pressure. a sense that even rest must be earned, even moments of silence must be justified, and the idea of sitting still for 7 minutes just to explore your inner world feels unproductive. That's the lie. Terence McKenna saw this obsession with productivity as a form of modern enslavement. Not by force, but by ideology, the belief that our value comes from our usefulness. But he reminded us, you are not a cog in someone else's machine. You are a sovereign consciousness, a complex, mysterious, emotional being whose depth can't be measured in productivity charts. The 7-minute practice is a direct challenge to that inner tyrant. It's a refusal to be defined by how much you get done, and a step toward being defined by how much you truly are. But that shift isn't easy, especially if you've spent decades being responsible for others, for outcomes, for appearances. The guilt of resting, of doing nothing, can feel suffocating. You may sit down for those 7 minutes and immediately want to reach for your phone, fix something in the house, check your calendar. That's not weakness. That's the internalized voice of a culture that fears stillness. McKenna would say, notice it, don't fight it, observe it as you would a passing hallucination, because that's what it is, an inherited hallucination of worth tied to effort. True transformation begins when you allow yourself to do nothing, not lazily but intentionally, to value stillness as sacred, to treat quiet as medicine, to let the silence remind you you exist beyond your roles. Those 7 minutes aren't a break from life. They're an invitation back into it. There's a part of you that has been quiet for a very long time. It's not the part that knows how to pay bills, meet deadlines, or smile politely when things are falling apart. It's not the part that keeps the peace in family dinners or sacrifices rest for the sake of responsibility. It's the deeper, quieter voice, the one you may have heard clearly when you were young before life asked you to be someone else. Terence McKenna believed that much of our suffering comes from forgetting this authentic self. Not because we choose to forget, but because we're taught to suppress it, to be reasonable, normal, safe. He called the modern adult mind the victim of a systematically imposed ignorance. In other words, we are trained to forget who we really are. But that self is still there. And 7 minutes a day can be enough to start listening again. This isn't about inner child work or psychological deep dives, though those can help. This is about creating space each day to simply ask, what part of me have I abandoned? What truth have I ignored because it was inconvenient or embarrassing or disruptive? Often the forgotten self is not loud. It speaks through images, sensations, sudden memories, or tears we can't quite explain. That's why silence and slowness are essential. They allow that subtle voice to rise above the noise. You might sit quietly and feel a longing you haven't named in years, or recall a dream that feels strangely significant, or realize that the version of yourself you show the world no longer fits. This is not weakness. This is awakening. McKenna insisted that the journey inward was not a luxury. It was survival. A culture that disconnects people from their own depth is a culture headed toward collapse. But individuals who reconnect, even in small daily rituals, become resilient, creative, and unpredictable in the best way. They stop living out scripts. They start living from presence. So sit, breathe, and ask, what have I silenced within myself? And is it time to listen again? We tend to treat time as if it were an enemy. We race against it, try to manage it, resent how little of it we have left. Especially after 45, the relationship with time changes. You feel its weight more. You sense its edges. You count more backward than forward, not out of fear, but because you know. Time is no longer abstract, it's personal. But Terence McKenna urged us to reconsider our entire relationship with time. He didn't see it as linear or mechanical. To him, time was a carrier of novelty, a spiral, a teacher, even a kind of intelligence. He said, time is a fractal wave of novelty and habit, which means that our experience of time depends on the quality of our attention, not the quantity of hours. In practical terms, this means 7 minutes of intentional presence can carry more life than 7 hours of unconscious motion. Time expands when we show up. It shrinks when we're on autopilot. Think about it. Some of your most vivid memories probably happened in just a few minutes. A conversation, a decision, a glance, a moment where you woke up inside your life. McKenna's work reminds us that time isn't the measure of transformation, awareness is. This is liberating, especially for older adults. It means you haven't missed your chance. It means 7 minutes can still matter. You don't need to reverse time. You need to redefine how you engage with it. In your daily practice, don't ask, how much time do I have left? Ask instead, how much of myself am I bringing to this time right now? Because that's where reality bends. That's where meaning emerges. And that's where McKenna believed the evolution of consciousness truly happens. Not in massive leaps, but in sustained, attentive presence. Time is not the jailer. It's the invitation. And each day you sit, breathe, and observe, you are saying yes. At the heart of Terence McKenna's philosophy was one powerful, often unsettling truth. There are no maps. Not really. No expert, no institution, no tradition, not even McKenna himself can tell you what your consciousness is supposed to be. You are not here to follow a script. You are here to explore, to question, to experiment. And in that spirit, he reminded us, you are not a passive observer. You are a co-creator of reality. So what does that mean for someone in the second half of life? It means your story isn't over. It means 7 minutes a day isn't a trick or a gimmick. It's a laboratory, a place where you test what's real for you. You've spent decades adapting, surviving, caring for others, trying to be what the world expected. But now it's time to find out what happens when you stop outsourcing your truth. When you sit quietly for those 7 minutes, with no phone, no news, no distraction, you're not just relaxing. You're reclaiming the power to choose your lens, your focus, your narrative. You begin to ask the questions that no one else can answer for you. What if the reality I've accepted is incomplete? What if the person I've become isn't the person I still want to be? What if the next version of my life is waiting for me to show up? McKenna taught that reality is a feedback loop. What you bring to it, it reflects back. You don't need to change the world in one bold move. You just need to engage with it differently, even for a few intentional minutes each day. This script isn't offering you another self-help routine. It's an invitation to stop waiting, to stop shrinking, to stop assuming it's too late. Because the moment you reclaim your attention, your perception, your curiosity, that's when the transformation begins. You are the experiment. You are the question. You are and have always been the one capable of changing your reality. 7 minutes is enough. If you give them your full presence, they can change everything. The most powerful revolutions don't begin with riots or speeches. They begin in silence, in small, deliberate choices made by people who refuse to keep living unconsciously. Terence McKenna called for a personal revolution of perception. He knew that changing the world begins with changing the lens through which you see it. And that begins with you, alone, for just a few minutes a day. 7 minutes might sound trivial, but it's not the time, it's the intention. It's the moment you choose to pause, to breathe, to see beyond the noise. In that pause, you become dangerous. Not in a violent way, but in a free way. You are no longer hypnotized by what society says you must be. This is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you forgot. So let this practice be your quiet act of rebellion. Let it be the place where your soul stretches out and takes a deeper breath. Let it be the start of a life lived from the inside out. And remember, no one else needs to understand. This is your revolution, your return, your truth. 7 minutes at a time.